Today on CityCast Chicago, in the lead up to Brandon Johnson's inauguration next month as the 57th mayor of Chicago, a lot of attention has been paid to public schools and police, but there are other pressing issues facing the city that Johnson will need to tackle pretty early. The CityCast team takes a closer look at what the new mayor needs to do about transportation, public health, and the environment. It's Tuesday, April 11th. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. Obviously, we talked a lot about election season being over, but the minute that happens, we actually got to get into governance. And, there are a lot of things that Brandon Johnson and the new city council are going to have to focus on when they get in. CTA, deservedly so, gets a lot of attention in here. It's a public transit network used by hundreds of thousands of people every single year. But there have been concerns over the last few years in terms of crumbling infrastructure. Ridership has been down since the pandemic. You have an increase of what people feel like is unsafe conditions when riding the CTA, when waiting for CTA. And the concern and the question people have been asking is, what is the future of Dorval Carter? Carrie, you still use CTA pretty much every week, I believe. You heading into the WeWork, you use it sort of just in your daily life. How do you see Brandon Johnson sort of coming out the gate looking at transportation holistically?
Yeah, I use it far less often than I used to. I used to rely on it absolutely every day, like many people. And obviously, that there was a huge shift when so many of us were working from home in 2020 and even into 2021. And, Jacoby, we work from home now. But as you mentioned, I enjoy not working from home. So I rent a space, a co-working space. So I was surprised, or I suppose I am surprised, that Brandon Johnson didn't explicitly say he would replace current CTA head Dorval Carter. Mm-hmm. He did say in a couple debates that there's a leadership problem there, but wouldn't go so far as to say like he's gone, which is strategic. Probably he wants to get in and see what the real problems are. But the reality is that the Regional Transportation Agency chairman Kirk Dillard has said that there's going to be a mass transit funding cliff, which means that the CTA, the Metro, the commuter rail line, and, which you use in the city, PACE, which is a suburban public transit bus system, there will be like $730 million short, he said, of operating funds that they need by 2025. So what does this mean for the rider? That always comes down to, will there be a fare hike? Yeah. There's always talk of like, will it cost me more to ride public transit? And that's going to be a very hard sell if you feel like your bus doesn't arrive, these ghost buses, doesn't arrive on time. You feel like the trains aren't safe or clean. You feel like there's people smoking on them and you have to keep moving cars to get away from that. All these sorts of issues, and that are making people really have a problem with public transit right now. So I don't know how they're going to fill that budget hole, that budget gap, and that's something that Johnson's going to have to face pretty quickly.
Yeah, I'm interested to see what kind of strategies are implemented, because Johnson has focused on some of the infrastructure issues, right? He talked about wanting to implement more bus priority in terms of like transit signal priority to make sure bus lanes are protected. He wanted to make sure there are more CTA running, including for late evening. But I do wonder how you're going to tackle, like you say, sort of how people feel when they're on the train. And as somebody who rides Metro, rides the CTA, one of the major differences that I see is because Metro has conductors on the train, there's sort of always this presence of Metro. But when we talk about a CTA, there's sort of been this pushback of, well, what would that mean for the trains, right? You have somebody on the bus and, the people who are driving the bus don't feel safe. And so I wonder how he negotiates that, because he hasn't said he's against adding security to buses and trains, adding cameras, but didn't really sort of make that clear what sort of the plan is for that. And as somebody who doesn't and didn't like to see more sort of green jackets, right? Those sort of security individuals, less
private security,
roaming around the blue line, seeing dogs and wondering sort of is this providing any deterrence? How do we make structural changes? I wonder how he prioritizes that coming in. Activists and transit advocates want to make sure that we're not just talking about public transportation, though. Like, so what's going to happen with buses? What's going to happen with trains? They also want to make sure we're thinking about how do we make the city more walkable? How do we make the city more bike friendly? And that is something that Johnson also focused on during his campaign, and people could see on his website. You know, he talked about how do we provide protection to all bike lanes around the city. He talked about wanting to reduce speed limits, while at the same time saying he wanted to maybe take down some of those speed cameras. And so I'm interested again to see, you know, sort of how do we balance those two things, because most people have acknowledged that those speed cameras, you do see some shifts around how fast people are going around there, maybe some reduction of accidents, but people also know it's a metric for revenue for the city. And so
Absolutely.
Are we having both conversations at the same time? Because if we don't want to just be nicking people, right? These little petty fines and fees, because we know who that largely and disproportionately impacts. And I wonder, as we sort of get into his administration, how, like, sort of where the line gets drawn on that.
These are somewhat conflicting points of view, right? A lot of bike transit advocates say, no, actually, the speed cameras have been really good for us.
Mm-hmm.
They have, just think about it. Think if you're going X speed and you hit a biker, a car hits a biker. Now reduce that by 25 miles per hour or whatever. It's completely different. It's life and death, right? As someone who gets absolutely nicked by the speed camera, but who I do feel like I'm much more aware of my speed now. I know where the cameras are, so you can start to sort of be like, okay, yeah, I always go through this intersection at Western. I'm going to be more careful here. But I'm just also more aware because there's a very, like 35, like going, so it's, you know, you get a ticket if you're going 6 miles per hour over. 35 miles per hour and 36 miles per hour don't feel much different, but you are, at least you're forcing yourself to engage and be more aware. Johnson also actually said that we need more protected bike lanes, which is like, he's saying we need concrete barriers that protect lanes, the bike lanes, from cars and traffic. So much of Chicago, you have these bike lanes that are also where people are walking. And as we know, so many delivery trucks are parked and blocking. This is where people get doored, like cars are opening their doors here. And so if you are a commuter by bike, you know, which is more affordable, which is better for the environment, is all these things, you deserve to be safe too. Just like pedestrians and, like you said, people who ride public transit, but also would just to not be such a car culture and not be so reliant on people who just commute by car.
What I'm going to be looking for is, even from our conversation with Johnson, there were some things that he said he wanted to do immediately in terms of improving projects or approving and continuing projects that would make sure that bus lanes get priority, both in the way that they're designed, they're painted on the street, the way they're designated, as well as the transit signs, but also sort of in, like, as you said, improving protected bike lanes, more concrete bike lanes around the city. I'm going to be watching to see how fast those projects move, because the last administration promised similar upgrades as well. In a debate in March, Brandon Johnson and Paul Vallas were asked, what is their plan moving forward in terms of the leader of the Chicago Department of Public Health, Allison Arwoody? Paul Vallas said that he wanted to keep Allison Arwoody on. And Brandon Johnson said very clearly he does not plan to keep the commissioner on, who has been here, has been in the Chicago Department of Public Health since, I think, 2015, who then became the leader of the Chicago Department of Public Health, I believe, like right before the pandemic really sort
like
of
2019,
blew up, right at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. And so moving forward, it is likely that one of his appointments early on will be a new commissioner of the Chicago Department of Public Health. You know, we sat down with Dr. Allison Arwoody. We've given the sort of benefit of the doubt for leading this city through the pandemic thus far. What has Brandon Johnson and his team said thus far as why he doesn't align with the commissioner?
So far as I can, is what I glean from his, his comments in that debate, which were fairly minimal. They didn't really give him an opportunity to really dive into why he wants to replace her. The sort of tagline has been because if we all remember, Rahm Emanuel closed 6 of the city's 12 mental health clinics. And Mayor Lightfoot said on her, when she was running in 2019, I'm going to reopen those. Because as we see with a lot of these closures, like with school closures, these disproportionately, affect people in Black and brown communities that have seen disinvestment from the city. And she didn't reopen them. And Johnson accredits that to CDPH, Chicago Department of Public Health head Allison Arwady. Now, my thought a little bit when I dig into this and read more about it is that you didn't reopen these mental health clinics becomes a bit of a tagline. The Progressive Caucus in City Council was big on this. But what Arwady says is she sort of put together sources of state, federal funding, city funding to provide more care. And, says that like in 2020 or 2021, something like 5 times as many residents receive care. Well, one might say we were in a pandemic. Probably more people needed mental health care. Kids were at home from school. People were losing their jobs. There were a myriad of issues. But it's also somewhat of this approach that sort of public health departments, it's not really their job to provide direct patient care. It's their job to overall surveil trends, to prevention, to, God forbid we have another pandemic. It's them that they need to sort of shape policy, and they're not supposed to be so much directly involved in patient care. So I would say also we would be remiss, I think, if we didn't mention that Brandon Johnson might have some ill will towards Arwady because she was on the other side of the table when the teachers union didn't want to reopen schools, CPS, in 2022. Arwady and the mayor were saying, no, it's time. Kids have to go back. So they had a difference of opinions back then. So that might be affecting what he's saying about whether he wants to keep her around.
I do want to say, having like read up with Alderperson Rosanna Rodriguez, who's been a sort of hugely critical of Dr. Allison Arwady.
Yeah.
As I look more into the sort of why behind that, I understand that the CTU and Chicago Department of Public Health didn't always agree, but I do think, Brandon Johnson's organizing background, really does in line with how do we strengthen public goods and the network of sort of public and private funded healthcare centers and clinics really does sort of end up being a neoliberal approach that really sort of takes the impetus and the responsibility away from the city to provide this resource and starts to over-rely on sort of the private healthcare system and
contractors that the city pays. And
I'd argue that system, that even Alderperson Rosanna Rodriguez, and I don't want to speak for her, but that system can work in connection with the sort of robust, heavily funded public system. Because what ends up happening is, same when we talk about public schools, you see this divestment away from public mental health care centers. Then the criticism starts and say, well, they're not providing resources. They're not doing enough. Then you close them, right? Then the pressure on that last 6 sort of grows and grows and grows to the point where say, well, is this doing enough? Because the system we have now is one that ultimately disadvantages those city-funded and city-run centers. And so what Johnson is arguing is that if he reopens 6, provides them with the resources they need, but then maybe grow that system, that we're sort of balancing out the responsibility between the public and the private versus what we see right now is this, sort of overwhelming reliance on sort of the privatization of healthcare in this city and at large.
I think you're saying more holistic approach, right? Like maybe it's not either or. Maybe there's diverting some of that funding from whatever she calls what it's currently called sort of these trauma-informed centers of care.
And some of the grant money that goes there.
Yeah.
Honestly, when we get into where is the city going to get the money, that's always the question. Of course. Every candidate, sort of makes these promises of what they're going to do. At the end of the day, I do think that the money exists, right? It's out there. It really comes down to what do we prioritize? Where do we want to see our money go? And, 56 million for, shuttered mental health centers against, a $1.96 billion police budget. People will always say, well, I think I know where $56 million is, right? I know where we could probably find $50 million. But then the question becomes, yes, where does that money come from? And so, we'll see how Johnson moves forward. But it does seem like even more than Lightfoot, who was able to run on these tenets, but didn't actually have a background in maybe supporting these, right? These were sort of more campaign promises and idea than even Johnson, who, he has a track record of being on the bullhorn advocating for these ideas. So I think it will be even more disappointing if these promises aren't delivered on this time around for individuals. But I do agree with you. We're always going to wonder over the next 4 years, and maybe the contract negotiations will illuminate a little bit more of how this relationship is going to work. But I do think it probably is fair, right? Because if this was any other sort of lobbying position, we'd be like, okay, what do you owe this organization? And so I don't think it's unfair to continuously ask, but that question is going to come up time and time again. But I do want to give the benefit.
I don't think that's driving all of it.
I agree.
I don't think that's driving everything. I think there are bigger questions of sort of funding for these mental. I guess the bigger when I talk to public health folks, they say sort of the top line everybody hears is like they shuttered clinics. Mm-hmm. Instead of asking the necessary but more important follow-up question of like, where is the care? What kind of care is being provided now? What kind of care there's still a gap? Mm-hmm.
Now, of all the issues we're discussing today, I think this last one has probably gotten the least amount of attention during campaign season, and that is Chicago's environment, right? How do we continue to protect neighborhoods that deal with air pollution? How do we protect neighborhoods that are still sort of dealing with the consequences of industry, both industry leaving and industry being there and proliferating for decades upon decade? And Brandon Johnson talked a lot throughout his campaign about wanting to bring back Chicago's Department of Environment, which, similar to some of the mental health care centers, this was eliminated during the Rahm Emanuel administration. And it was said that it was a budget decision, that it would save the city about $3.6 million, mostly through layoffs. Then Mayor Lightfoot ran on the campaign promise of bringing back the Department of Environment, ultimately did not deliver on that. And now we're here. Since the Department of Environment was disbanded, a guest who we had on a few months ago wrote this great article that said environmental violations fell by 50% and air quality citations fell by 90%, with the implication being that, well, without the Department of Environment sort of enforcing, trying to hold companies and industry accountable in this city, that sort of it's been a little bit easier to get by in terms of business as usual, right? And I wonder if, as we've had these environmental justice wins over the last few years, right, as we see advocacy growing to not move manufacturing plants to historically Black and brown neighborhoods, if maybe some people's eye has sort of gotten off the ball in the fact that the city still doesn't have one central department focusing on ways to not only hold companies accountable, but start planning and being innovative about what this city faces when we think about the consequences of climate change moving forward. Carrie, we've covered this a lot over the show, right? Do you think we've heard enough about how a Department of Environment will work against some of that?
Not really. And, I think you raise a really good point of like, when you don't have a centralized office to, herald these changes, but also really push and fight for them and advocate for them, instead your sort of new businesses get with the General Iron, the metal shredder that was supposed to move to the southeast side, that gets pushed to the law department because Lightfoot's, she blocked them. Her administration blocked them from moving. So that gets pushed there. It also gets pushed to the public health department, who she relies on Dr. Allison Arwoody to say, no, this is bad for air quality here. It also just gets pushed to all the business development folks, right? Yeah. So you don't really have, when I hear that number of 3 point whatever it saved, like, it just seems like such chump change compared to some other departments.
No, for sure. I feel like Chicago was like $2 million or something. Just to print those cans. But the point you make, I think
Chicago. Yeah.
When I was reading the Cranes report that came out in October of 2011 that talked about the Department of Environment being closed down, and it said things like Clean Vehicles Initiative will go to the Transportation Department. Utility bill assistance will go to the Department of Family and Support Services. Water policy goes to the Department of Water Management, which when you just do sort of like the elementary school, like match this with the department that it makes sense going to, right? It makes sense on paper. But then when you get into it, there was an advocate who says, but are those departments interested in the innovation needed to really think about how do we help families that are on payment plans to pay their water? Does the transportation department, right? Think about what we just talked about. Do they have enough initiative, enough people on staff, enough resources to also be thinking about clean vehicles, right? And so the question now becomes, well, if we're going to bring the Department of Environment back, does that mean we're pulling these responsibilities away? So I have no idea what the logistics behind putting together a Department of Environment will look like. I imagine it's going to cost a lot more than nearly $4 million.
Right.
But it does seem like a necessary element of governance, someone who is focused on these critical issues, especially as we're continuing to deal with lead in our water, which I'm going to always talk about, right? Record levels of pollution that impact the people who live here, but also neighboring states.
The climate plan, Mayor Lightfoot had laid out this whole climate plan that we sort of dipped our toes in here and there. But to your point, like you said, who's keeping track of all these violations? Activists, frankly, many of whom we've had on CityCast Chicago, they're the ones who are actually FOIAing or getting the public data and saying, wait a second, what happened with this, and this? And to your point, city departments, state departments, federal departments, even the private sector in many ways, there's always going to be this we don't have enough people, you're giving us more to do with less. So if you're just diverting those tasks, like you say, to other city departments, I'm sure that's their response, right? Yeah. I don't know. I'm trying to get bike lanes. I'm trying to protect Milwaukee Avenue bike lanes. I don't have time or space for this. So it will be interesting to see who Johnson brings on in his transition team for all of these departments, but this one as well, to see kind of how he's going to talk about the environment and approach it in his. Those are somewhat of a good indication who they put on their transition teams. It's a sort of a start to be a peek into how they're going to shape their administration. So he should be doing that soon. So it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, if I had to put my money on it, Dorval Carter, a holdover from the Emanuel administration, I don't think he stays around. Dr. Allison Arwoody started her time with the Chicago Department of Public Health during the Emanuel administration, promoted under Lightfoot. I don't think she's going to stick around. And the Department of Environment, if it is reinstated, would obviously have a new leader. And so those will be the early moves in the Johnson administration and some of the early indications of how he hopes to see these departments led in the future. And so thank you to lead producer Carrie Shepherd for joining me to talk everything trains, planes, and vaccinations and air pollution, all the things this morning.
Thanks, Jacoby. Appreciate it.
Before I let you go, some good news to get you through. The weather sort of picking up is coming just at the right time because Art on the Mart is back this Friday at 8:30 p.m. with Funtime Unicorn Ruby Rise through Four Seasons. If you're not familiar with what Art on the Mart is, downtown merchandise mart, an entire projection show across the building. So make sure you add it to your calendar this spring and summer season. As always, check out our daily newsletter, Hey Chicago, at chicago.citycast.fm, and I will talk to you bright and early tomorrow. Peace.